In West Virginia, over 7,000 children are in foster care, and the number is growing every day. Children are placed in foster care for a number of reasons: neglect, poverty, parental substance abuse, and abandonment, among many other discouraging reasons. Each child has a story, and they need our help. James 1:27 reminds us that this is what our faith is all about. Pure and undefiled religion before our God and Father is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress. So how can you help? Pray. Pray for the kids being impacted by the foster care crisis. Pray that they find the care, support, and love they need. Pray for the parents facing a challenging season apart from their children. Pray for current foster parents and new foster parents. Pray for our church as we take steps to make a difference. Give. Your giving helps us recruit and support foster, adoptive, and kinship families in our church and community in a variety of impactful ways. Give financially or purchase high-need items like clothes, bedroom furniture, gift cards, and other necessities to support foster families. Act. All of us can do something. You can serve a foster family by providing meals, yard work, babysitting, or simply calling to check in and offer support. Foster care families need a community of people to surround them and strengthen their efforts. There is something you can do even more. You can become a foster parent and welcome a child into your home. This is the biggest commitment you could make to change a child's life. If you think you're ready to take this step or want to learn more about it, we would love to help you get started, and we are here to walk alongside you each step of the way. We are taking big steps to put an end to a big problem, and we hope you'll come along with us on this journey. Let's pray, give, act, and foster West Virginia.
Okay, everyone, welcome back from your break. We are going to have a panel discussion now. Each of these women beside me have been working in this area. They have firsthand experience, and so I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then we will jump into our questions. So directly to my left here is Rachel Kinder of Mission West Virginia. She is the Frameworks Program Director at Mission West Virginia, where she has 15 years of experience in foster care, adoption, and kinship/relative care. Her goals are to communicate the dire need for foster parents, especially those willing to work toward reunification and birth family engagement. Concurrently, she works to highlight successful adoption stories, especially those involving older youth and teens. And she believes that the shortage of foster parents should be viewed as a social issue and addressed as a community need. She's also a mom to 2 children through both foster care and adoption and by birth. Rachel began her career at DHHR in CPS and Home finding. So this is Rachel with us here today. And then to her left is Marissa. Marissa is the Executive Director of the West Virginia Foster, Adoptive, and Kinship Parents Network. Definitely going to have to read these introductions because there's 4 of them. She's also a foster adoptive parent and knows firsthand the joys and challenges of being involved in the child welfare system. So Marissa is here with us today. Thank you for being here, Marissa. And then Pam Woodman-Kaehler is to her left, and she is the Office Director for the Foster Care Ombudsman Unit within the Unit of Inspector General. So essentially what that means is this service is devoted to improving child welfare by investigating and resolving complaints involving children who are in care and foster parents, monitoring legislation and policy, and maintaining a reporting system for system improvement. And so thank you, Pam, for being here with us today. And then Michelle is here in the blue, and she is with us from Bible Center Church. She has served on staff there since 2002, and she oversees both local and global outreach through such programs as adoption and foster care ministries, homeless outreach, various other ministries. And so, Michelle, thank you for being here with us today. So those are longer introductions, and maybe some of you heard things and you're like, what does that even mean? What does that look like? And so in layman's terms, I think what you really need to understand is that each of these women are serving in roles where they are working in the community advocating for foster families, for children in care, for what we would call primary families or birth families. And so they are doing this work day in and day out through different avenues. And so we're going to get to know a little bit more about their experience, okay? So Rachel, at Mission West Virginia, you work with a lot of foster and potential foster parents. Tell us a little bit about foster care numbers in West Virginia. Who are these kids? Where do you see the biggest need for foster care in the state?
Sure. So in the last, I would say, 5 to 7 years, we've had a huge increase in the number of children in foster care in West Virginia. At one point, we were over 7,000, which is the highest it's ever been. Right now, we're at about 6,600. Over 50% of those children are placed in relative and kinship care, which I think is a big strength of our state, and I think that's also something I get to talk about in my next question. But that's over half of the kids. We have an additional about 2,000 placed in traditional foster family homes, and then the remaining kids are placed in shelters, group settings, residential, both in and out of state. Our largest age group in West Virginia is the 1 to 5 year old. So we have more children in that age range than any other age range, but that's a little bit misleading because that is not our hardest to place age range. That's an easier age range to find foster placements for. What we really need more help with is finding families for teens. As far as the biggest need for foster care in West Virginia, you're going to get my really subjective answer because I work in foster parent recruitment, so I'm going to talk about there's a huge need for foster families. There's a lot of media that likes to describe it as we're in a foster care crisis. I don't like to use that term because I think it implies that it's temporary. We have a big problem, we're going to fix it and move on from this crisis. I've worked in child welfare for 2 decades, and we've never had enough foster parents. When we don't have enough foster parents, it means that kids can't be placed within their communities, they have to change schools, they often can't even be placed in their same county, which creates barriers to visitation with biological family, barriers to reunification. It means splitting up sibling groups, and it means putting older kids in group residential shelter care. And when I say older, that's not always the teenagers that you are picturing. It breaks my heart when I'm mailing baby dolls to kids in residential placements because it's not just teenagers. One of my real personal goals for this year has been to communicate that this is not just a DHHR problem, this is a community problem. It's really easy to read that piece in the newspaper and go, wow, DHHR has giant problems to fix, and they do. But we've never had enough foster parents, and until we embrace these kids as these are part of our community, this is issue. These are kids that go to school with our own kids. That's my goal for us to embrace that as a social issue across all communities.
Thanks, Rachel. I would just reiterate what she said about, these are kids that are in school with your kids that you pass by in the grocery store, maybe on a random day. And so thank you for painting that picture for us and helping us understand. Marissa, you run the biggest network of foster, kinship, and adoptive families in West Virginia. We know that fostering is very difficult and that 80% of foster families stop fostering within 2 years. You've been quoted as saying that foster care is a journey no one should take alone. Can you tell us what you mean by that and why you think that?
Thanks. So Rachel just talked about the need to recruit more families, and I get sort of the other side of that, which is retaining, because no matter how much we recruit, we will never be able to replace all the families that we lose if we don't focus on retaining them. And one of the ways that we do that, so as a foster parent, I experienced this. I felt somewhat isolated. It was hard to share some of the challenges with people who didn't experience foster care. Now, fortunately, when I took the training at the beginning, I had a friend from church who was a foster parent, and I would have lunch with her every week, and while I was taking the training, and I would say, okay, here's all the questions I didn't want to ask in class. Or I would say, this is what they said in class, now tell me how it works in the real world. Because I'm pretty sure that's not entirely accurate. But as I have connected and worked with foster parents across the state, and when I say foster, I mean foster, adoptive, and kinship. We really need a term that encompasses all of them. as I connect with those families, I hear over and over, I felt so isolated. I stopped fostering after I adopted, or I stopped after the last placement left because I felt so isolated, because my friends and families and neighbors are not having these experiences. Their children don't have the same challenges. Many people have had the experience of people saying, well, if it's so hard, why don't you just give them back? Or they don't understand the grief when a child leaves my home after I've loved on them for a week or 6 months or a year or however long it's been. So working to connect foster, adoptive, and kinship families across the state, both to support each other, and we know from research that peer support really does help us retain families. It helps families foster longer. We've seen that through the network from some surveys that we've done and things, that people feel like when they have a place to go to ask questions that feels safe from other people who've had the same experiences, that they can do it longer, and they feel like they can stick it out a little bit longer. But also then we can come together and advocate. And one of the things that I've really done very consciously in West Virginia is work with all foster, adoptive, and kinship. While there are some states that, and as a system, we like to divide everybody into these little groups. Well, we're going to give these services to foster parents and these services to kinship families and these to, and I'm going, they're all families. Birth families too, they're all families. Yes, there are some nuances of differences, but really we all, and when we come together, what happens when we divide into those smaller groups is we have less power. So when we all come together and can advocate together and support each other together, then we have more ability to have a voice and make a difference. So.
A lot of the work that we do reflects Marissa's quote about, this not being a journey that we believe in journeying alone. And so we see on a daily basis how churches have the opportunity to make a huge impact in that idea of retaining foster families. At your county office, there is likely a staff person whose job is threefold. They're to recruit families, they're to license those families, and then they're to retain those families. And that is way too big of a job for one person alone or even a small staff. And so we're going to talk about ways today, practical ways that churches can come alongside and help to do some of that retaining work, help to really support those families in meaningful ways. So we can come up with a lot of good ideas on our own of things that we want to do kind of in a silo, but why not learn from others who have done this before and who can do things that are really effective for families and support families in really effective and meaningful ways to help retain them for the long haul. Pam, in your role at the Ombudsman's Office, you help families and others solve issues and resolve complaints with foster care. What is the biggest frustration and barrier that you hear from families and others in West Virginia about the foster care system itself?
Jessi, thank you. This is a good question, and I think it's a courageous question, because in order to be able to address that, I have to approach it with some candor, and that candor at times can be uncomfortable. But I'm used to being uncomfortable. If your audience is not aware of it, it was not part of my introduction, I don't think. I was a child protective services worker here in West Virginia for just under 5 years. I know uncomfortable. I'm comfortable with uncomfortable to some extent, and I am 18 years a foster and adoptive parent certified here in West Virginia. Have been, still am. So I have some experience with this. And when I thought about, when I think about this question, I think about the word that I hear, I've heard it a few times today, alone and isolated. In fact, I think like Lynn had said, I tend to be a data person myself. That's part of the command of the office that I operate, but I also just tend to be that way anyway. And I've started counting the number of times that I hear those words. So it wouldn't surprise you that when you ask about the biggest frustration and barrier that we hear, it's multifaceted but connected to those terms, isolated and alone. First, one of the biggest frustrations is not being able to reach a DHHR or a CPS worker, whoever it is that is the state worker that is responsible for the case or for the child or the family or the children, not being able to reach them when you as a family feel that you need them. And you may need them for things like information, permissions, status, case information, and approvals. And sometimes those things feel very time sensitive, critical, urgent, important. Not being able to reach someone who has the answers that you desperately need is probably the number one frustration. But it is matched by things like feeling disrespected, feeling undervalued, feeling as if you're being treated dismissively, feeling powerless in a system that has lots of different power dynamics within it. The way that operationalizes feeling treated dismissively or disrespectfully makes you feel very alone, unsupported, and that operationalizes because when you don't get a return telephone call, you're not invited to the meeting, you don't get the key information that at least you feel you need, then that all plays into that feeling and you feel unsupported and alone. There's tremendous fear in more than 90% of the calls we receive at our office. Fear of breaking a rule, making mistakes, going beyond one's authority, or being perceived as a pest. And because of that, people are very afraid to ask for help and therefore also feel supported and alone. And finally, there isn't a context to understand what this term best interest really means. And best interest is often in the eye of the beholder. And when you are caring for kids that have experienced abuse, neglect, trauma, isolation, your perception of what is best may be very different than what others' perception of best interest is. It's frustrating not to understand the big picture, but if you're not part of the team, then you don't get the big picture to help make sense of it all. And that's a combination of barriers and frustrations that often leads to the failure to retain that Marissa pointed out earlier.
Thank you, Pam. I love that illustration, and that's really powerful. Thank you for making those connections for us. As Pam talks, she's talking about the experience of foster families, the experience of families. And I know I've sat across church staff sometimes, and they can be a little bit nervous about inviting families to that, right? Like that can be a nervous conversation to have. And so what I want you to hear today, as you hear about the real life experience of these families, is to also know that there is something that we can do about that. Like Lynn talked about earlier, there are things that we can do and we have the ability to do. And so I don't want you to lose that in it as well. Michelle, you are a foster parent and also the director of outreach at Bible Center Church, where you oversee a foster care ministry. Having experience as a foster parent and working with many families through the church, how do you think that foster care is different than most people imagine?
I think at its base, foster care can sometimes be perceived as these children are from families that are bad people. And boy, just my own personal experience, often the parents of these children were the foster children of the decade ago. I had a personal experience with my first foster son, and that was the case with his birth mom. And so understanding that these are people that are hurt, they've experienced trauma, there's sadness, and helping a church understand that in Romans we're told, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. We don't wait, God doesn't wait for us to get better before he's going to love us and care for us. And trauma causes issues in people's hearts and lives. And so loving people first, I think, is so important. And so being perceived as a bad person simply because you've got foster somewhere in your history or your situation currently. Also, I like to say I'm contagious, but getting to spend time with kids, they're kids, look into their eyes. They have dreams for the future. They have wishes and want to be loved and cared for. My husband and I adopted a 17-and-a-half-year-old girl who Rachel knows well. And she had been in 37 places I counted those when we got her child summary at her adoption. She's a beautiful person that had a lot of heartache and a lot of abandonment. And so if we can look at the side of the thing, and look at things like there are things that happen to these individuals, and they're really often reacting in a self-protective way. They're not out to hurt anyone. That's, I think, the biggest thing. It's often perceived as people that aren't as good as, or, and then once you start doing foster care in a community, you get to help each other, support each other, love each other on the journey, and you realize we're all human. None of us are perfect, and it can be a great joy. It's hard, but it's a great joy, and it's an honor and a privilege. We get to show a reflection of God adopting us by taking care of these children and loving their birth families. I think that maybe is one of the biggest misconceptions, and you can love them well, even if reunification doesn't happen. This past year, 2 of my adopted children's birth mom died, and my husband's a pastor, and he did her funeral. Like, it's a beautiful mess. It's a mess, but it can be beautiful.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Rachel, we talk about foster care a good bit, but Mission West Virginia also serves kinship families. Tell us a bit more about what kinship care is, how common it is in West Virginia, and what those families face.
Sure. So a couple quick definitions. In West Virginia, we have over half of our foster care population living in relative and kinship families. And then we have even more informal caregivers who are not in DHHR custody, but children who are being informally raised by relatives. Even the census does not do well collecting that information, but the numbers are huge. In West Virginia, if a child is removed and placed in foster care, there's federal and state law that says relatives and kinship should be given priority if they are available and appropriate. And that doesn't just mean blood ties. It can be some type of familial relationship, or it can be some type of pre-existing relationship. I talked to a lot of teachers who have taken in placement of children that they know who were taken into foster care. At Mission West Virginia, we have run a program since 2019 called Kinship Navigators, and they work specifically with children who are, well, with families where the children are in state custody and the child has been placed with a relative or with a kinship family, or what we sometimes call fictive kin. We actually have one of our navigators here with us today, if you would want to talk to her later. But basically, they contact the family as soon as the child is placed and really try to figure out what their needs are. And there's a lot of talk about, what services and what therapies and what all do they need for these kids who've experienced trauma and removal. But our program really kind of works Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because at the beginning, we're really looking at shelter, food, and clothing, and the very basics. What we have observed of the system is that there's a difference between policy and reality. So you can look at the family and say, Grandma gets TANF, and she gets a medical card, and she gets this and this and this. But the reality is we talked to Grandma, and there was a delay with her TANF benefits, and she didn't get a medical card, and the clothing voucher is being issued, but she doesn't have it yet. And one of the examples I always give is a grandma who took overnight placement of 4 or 5 kids and was signing up for everything that she needed and was eligible for, but she goes to the WIC office, and the WIC is still in the birth mom's name, and Grandma doesn't have the right paperwork to sign up for WIC in her own name. And in the meantime, she does have food stamps, but you can't buy formula with food stamps at Walmart because it's a baby item, not a food item. So there's a lot of, they have this and this and this, but the reality is that they need a lot of assistance just to get what they are eligible for and what they very immediately need to care for these kids. Other things that these families need, like Pam said, they need to be included in the cases, and they frequently suffer from not having updates on what's going on in the child's case. They need to understand their role. Overnight, they might go from being grandma to being the primary parent for these kids. Their own children are likely not allowed in their house anymore, or can only see the grandkids under supervised visitation. They need to be an active part of the case so that they can understand their role and what the expectations are, and so that they can follow those. And our program provides a lot of emotional support, just a lot of listening, a lot of validating feelings, a lot of saying, wow, that's really hard or that's really unfair, and I'm going to try to help and see what I can do. But these grandparents and other relatives, did not plan to be raising a second family, did not plan emotionally, physically, financially for this. So these are families that have less notice and more of an emotional toll, I think. So there's a lot of needs with these families.
Marissa, in our national work at Promise 686, we are increasingly stressing the importance of working with what we call primary families, which includes birth families that are struggling in many different ways, as well as foster families. How important is it for foster families to navigate that relationship with the primary family, and what are some ways that you've seen families manage that relationship?
Yeah, so this is something that I think West Virginia has started to embrace a little bit, although it's a relatively new concept if you look at the history of foster care. And we still have I have many families who say to me, I would love to get to know the birth family. The caseworker won't give me their contact information, or they tell me I'm not allowed to talk to them. And that's often one reason that families are not included at meetings, because, well, if the birth family's there, we don't know if we want the foster family in the same room, which then actually just increases this sort of animosity feeling. And I wanted to touch on something that Michelle had said about, the misconception. I think we often have a misconception that being a foster parent is about rescuing a child from horrible parents or from a bad situation, and really it's about loving a family. And it can be a little bit of when foster parents come in, especially if they come in with this attitude that, I'm going to rescue a child, I'm going to adopt them, I want to build my own family by adopting kids from other families. I think it can be a little bit of a culture shock when they come in and go, wait a minute, and I still battle that even with some of the families I work with. Well, they'll say, well, they shouldn't have visits because they had a dirty drug test. Well, kids aren't carrots that we dangle and say, or often they'll say, well, why didn't they stop using drugs when they took the kids? Well, I want all of you in the room for a second to think back to the exercise we did at the beginning, where we talked about having to let go of each thing when you're, evacuating in an emergency situation. And kids go through that, but so do the birth families. And as they're having to let go of, you just took the most precious thing from them and caused trauma in doing that. And likely they're using drugs or they're struggling with whatever, oftentimes because of their own trauma. As you said, they've been in foster care. So you expect them to overnight have new coping mechanisms because you took their kids away and caused more trauma. So I think when we start to talk about that with foster families, they start to kind of understand that. And the other thing I think we don't talk about enough is the impact of foster care and adoption on kids. They're not plants. We don't take them from one environment, stick them in another environment, and go, just thrive, adjust to the new soil, and make it work. My son was removed at birth and has never known his birth mom, and I have sat with him as he has sobbed. At 6, he's 6 now. At 4, he would say, but I don't know who she is, and I don't know where she lives, and so we're trying to find her. I don't have it, I've never met her, but that's really essential to who he is and to understanding, where he's from. So I think that, it's absolutely key for families to really, especially if we're going to support reunification, which is what we should be doing, we have to be able to embrace and support birth families. It can be difficult to navigate, as I said. Many families aren't included at the meetings, feel like they don't have the information or they're not allowed to have the information. So how you manage that, there are some creative ways that some families, even in West Virginia, have used, like sending notes to visits or pictures to visits, or, hey, Mother's Day just passed, let me buy a gift for mom and send it with the kids, or have the kids pick out a gift or make something and send that with them. Letters about, here's what he did at school this week, and or in sports, or here's a new food that they love, or something like that, to really help. I had one family in our group who said that every visit that their kids had with birth mom, they sent a basket with activities. Yeah. So they would send, a DVD and popcorn and hot chocolate for a movie night, or they would send a game or something age appropriate, but something to kind of just support them in having a fun time together. And I thought, what a great way to support and encourage that relationship. And it can be challenging, especially if you don't know the family. I do remember the first time I sent a child in my home to a visit, I felt like I was feeding her to the wolves, because I didn't have that experience of getting to know them and understanding, why that was so important for them. And so I think it's really a mindset shift that we're starting to undergo and need to encourage.
Appreciate your honesty, Marissa, and sharing that with us. And I think about what you said, and I think about us, leaving today later and actually wanting to do things, right? Like, I don't want to just leave today with just information, nothing ever happens. And as you spoke about primary families and you spoke about that relationship, I was just thinking about the fact that, one small thing that we all have the opportunity to do today when we leave here that could have a huge impact in our churches is to remember what Marissa just said and to make sure that the language that we're using when we talk about families who either have children at risk of entering care, who have children currently in foster care, who are adults who are at one point were in foster care, whatever their story may be, to speak in a way that affirms their dignity, their God-given dignity, and really honors them. And I think that would be a challenge to us all, because all of us get frustrated or we're scared for kids and then we maybe react out of that. But to remember that we are talking about human beings and families that have experiences that we don't understand the full breadth of. And so we can speak in a way that honors them. And also, as we're out in the community talking to others about whether it's volunteering or whether it's potentially someone's interested in becoming a foster family, of creating that narrative, that idea of partnership with families, that idea of strengthening families, we get to help create that narrative in our churches when we're talking about this. And so I would just encourage you to consider that and think about your language when you're talking about this and how you either encourage or discourage that honoring.
Can I say one more thing?
Sure.
Sorry, this is one of those, you might want to turn the mic off. I might be here for a little bit. But I think the other thing that's important to keep in mind is that really we're all one visit from CPS away. From when you look at West Virginia numbers, we investigate more families and remove far more children than any other state in the country. So really, all of us are one CPS visit away from potentially being in that position. So I think thinking of it as, and as foster families, we really know that, because many foster families undergo investigations for often false allegations or, things. And as Lynn said, lots of kids are removed for poverty. For actual physical and sexual abuse make up a very small percentage of kids in care. So when we're talking about families who, if I lost my job tomorrow and I didn't have the support of my community and my family, I could be in that situation too, of not being able to care for my child. And so I think that we really, as a state, we have to really wrestle with that too, and also look at how do we as communities support families before they have kids enter care. I talk a lot about the neighborhood where I live. I'm literally geographically surrounded by people who would help out with my kid, who brought meals when we had COVID, and to the extent that we can just wrap around as a community around families who are struggling and not see them as, oh, well, they must be bad parents or they wouldn't have lost their kids. There's a lot of stigma there, I think, too.
Yeah, we have a lot of protective factors in our lives. It's likely that if you're here today, you have a lot of protective factors, meaning I have, if something happened in our lives, there would be a list of people, relationships that we have who could help step in and care for children. We have, whether it's your job, your education background, whatever it is, all of those kind of protective factors that help us out. And a lot of families don't always have that. Pam, you have been on the ground in child welfare in West Virginia, been a foster parent, and now direct the West Virginia Foster Care Ombudsman's Office. In your work, what is the most important lesson you've learned that you'd like to share with the audience?
Jessi, this question actually links very nicely to the question that I answered earlier that you asked. So I'm pleased that you're asking this, because there are things that one can do with a supportive ministry, with supportive people, but also things that people can do on their own to help reduce fear, stress, or frustration. These are the things that have helped me. Maybe they will help others. Anticipating a question like this, I made some notes. So there are mantras for me and lessons. The mantras that I tend to go to, I don't know if it's mantra or mantra, I'm not quite sure, but the ones that I tend to go to represent the coping skills that are most helpful to me and that I resort to or retreat to most often. I think they're good in life, and they're definitely good when you're dealing with child welfare work in any role that you may have. One is just roll with it. And that is where I have to confront the reality that I'm not in control of all things, nor should I be. So sometimes it just helps me to remember that it may be best to just roll with it, relinquish some control, and let things move the way that they may be intended or that God may intend for the situation. The other mantra that I tend to go to is, it's complicated, because all situations, just like all people and all families, are in no way created equal. So trying to read the tea leaves to predetermine what's going to happen, what they're going to do, what I should do, all of that can really just kind of get you messed up here. So sometimes I just have to rest on remembering that in this work, whatever your role, it's complicated, and it's not necessarily also for me to figure out. Another lesson or mantra that I go to is, things can change on a dime in this. In child welfare, things and statuses and situations and decisions can truly change on a dime. So the more I can detach from a particular outcome, the better off and more flexible that I can be emotionally and spiritually and physically. There is more than one right way to arrive at a conclusion or a solution. And the way that I may believe is best or right for a child or a family may not be the only right way or the right or best outcome, and I need to leave some flexibility for that. If I have time for a few more, those are the mantras, and then I have the lessons. In terms of lessons, the most helpful lesson has been learning how to effectively advocate. There's effective advocacy, and there is what I call indulgent advocacy. Effective advocacy is engaging the skills that really take the end in mind, where you clearly identify what you want to help accomplish, and you advocate with that in mind in your choice of words and actions. Advocating indulgently is where you do so primarily to get something off your chest or to, in some way, put others who you don't believe are necessarily doing things the way you want them to do it in their place. We very often in our office see people who, in good intent and with high emotion, advocate indulgently and ultimately end up hurting themselves, their credibility, and at times threatening their placement or the kids in their care. And we don't want to see that kind of thing happen. I learned lessons the hard way. I used to be a very indulgent advocate, and sometimes I think back to those days and I'm a little embarrassed. But I had to learn too, and so now I try to take those skills and help others. Yeah, I think that covers it.
Yeah, that's really challenging. I love that. Remind us of the terms again that you use. Indulging.
Effective advocacy.
Effective advocacy.
Versus indulgent advocacy. And here's what happens really in foster care and kinship care. There's all these different classes. There's all of this training.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you're taught and told early and often throughout the journey is that you live with the child, you care for the child for whatever period of time, and that you are to be their advocate. But what we don't see enough of in training and in messaging, which I am really trying to bring to the forefront, and our Bureau of Social Services is really listening, I'm very pleased about that, is we have to train them how to advocate effectively and what advocate role they hold, because not all advocates are created equal. Ask a lawyer what the term advocate means. Ask a community organizer what the term advocate means. Those are not the same thing. But we have to make sure that we parse that out, teach our families, so that when they do serve in their incredibly important advocate role, they do it in a way that improves and helps the situation and the children that they care so very much about, and maintains their strength and credibility.
I love that, and that's challenging to me for sure. In your work at Bible Center Church, Michelle, what are some ways that you have seen the church help foster kinship and adoptive families, or work to just improve the landscape of foster care in general?
So in our outreach ministries, it's really important to me to find gaps in our community. There's so many great organizations already doing wonderful things. I don't think we as a church should be competing with those or trying to duplicate services. So one of the first things we've set out to do was to find gaps. I'm a foster parent, adoptive parent now, and so that was a huge gap. You see it in the headlines, all the children in foster care. And once you get on the inside, you start to see other gaps. Our ministries and outreach are very related because foster care, as you said earlier, is very related to poverty, to trauma. There's lots of homelessness that's all connected. But because of the grandparents and foster parents not necessarily getting their vouchers right away or having what they need, my mentor, who's had 36 foster children, she's the person I would go to lunch with and learn from. And she and I got together and decided to start a foster closet. We had the first foster closet in Kanawha County, and she runs it. Her name's Donna. She's amazing. And we now help resource and just be support for 10 other foster closets. Recently, Donna got an award in Boone County for being like Volunteer of the Year or something. But the foster closet was just the beginning. And as you learn more and see more, grandfamilies, grandparents that are raising grandchildren are really struggling. Like you said, they don't always prepare ahead of time. Just this past week, we've started a new partnership where we're having grandfamilies lunches with another church in the community. And Bonnie Dunn was there from Grand Families and started talking about the great need to help them with home repairs. And at Bible Center, we have an outreach team called a repair care team. And so that's one of our new initiatives. But looking for those gaps, one of the things we did a couple years ago, we held a large trauma conference at our church. We had over 300 employees from Kanawha County school systems there because it matters in our community. And God instructs us to love and care for our neighbors. And we think doing those types of things is a way that we can love our neighbors well. We also have provided household items for children aging out of foster care. We have a ministry called Fresh Start. Anytime someone moves out of homelessness, for whatever reason, we help them with household items and whatever furniture we have available at that point in time. And one of my favorite times to do that is for children moving out or aging out of foster care. So look for the opportunities. It doesn't mean my church does everything right or we do it all. We don't. What does your congregation have? What abilities do you have? Who's in your congregation? What are they passionate about? And just capitalize on that. That's what I would recommend.
That's great, Michelle. And a couple of things stood out as she was talking. One of those is that she had a relationship with these community members who were already doing this work. She listened and looked for actual needs where her church could be effective. And then she worked in ways that were already a part of the culture of your church, things that y'all already had access to, things that you kind of already had teams or people that would be willing and able to do that. And so we've heard a lot about the experience of foster parents and about foster parenting, and something I want to make sure that we all recognize is that there are ways for people to engage in all different kinds of avenues. And maybe that's just through volunteering in a way that really plays on their skill set or what they're passionate about. There are so many different ways for churches to engage. And at Promise, we would call that family advocacy ministry. And The reason that we call it that is because we recognize that we heard about kind of these siloed things, right? We heard about serving foster parents and serving kinship families and all of these different things. And what we've realized, and I think many are realizing, is that we as the church have to engage in many different areas. And it's really about advocating for families and strengthening families. And so all of those things that Michelle just spoke about would fit under that umbrella of family advocacy ministry. And we think that that helps provide some clarity for churches and really helps in that way. So, Rachel, what are some of the main reasons children are in foster care, and what are some misconceptions about how these children get there, or children in general?
Okay, this one's my soapbox because I answer these questions all day long. So, children are in foster care because of abuse and neglect. Abuse and neglect is why children are in foster care. We have people call and ask if they could have placement of a child who has not undergone any trauma. Well, they would not be in foster care. Children are not in foster care because they are bad kids and they are juvenile delinquents. Children are not in foster care because they are orphans in the sense that both of their parents are deceased. And another soapbox here, over 80% of our cases involve some type of substance use. It may not be the primary reason for removal, but we have very high rates, and we have very high rates of children born with prenatal drug exposure. Help me banish the phrase drug babies. I still hear it. These children had prenatal drug exposure, or they experienced neonatal abstinence syndrome, NAS, after birth. So those are some really common misconceptions. Some other ones, that getting attached to the foster children in your home would be bad. Nope, please get attached to your foster children, and please don't be a foster parent if you're going to withhold attachment. These kids need attachment. Misconceptions that children will be, I think Marissa spoke about this, grateful to be rescued. Nope, they love their parents love them. They are not grateful to be rescued. They are experiencing loss. Children are not their behaviors. They are kids. We work with kids that have been in residential placements for 5 years. They should be angry. There is something wrong if they are not acting with anger. So these behaviors that make people scared to take in children in foster care, these are natural reactions to trauma that we have never experienced the level of that these kids have. And finally, these are just kids. Set aside the trauma and behavior, and these are still kids that want to fit in with their peers and have normal childhood experiences. DHHR is really having a policy and practice shift toward more normalcy and prudent parenting, which basically says children in foster care should live as similarly to their peers as we can possibly provide that experience. So we want these kids to be able to go on field trips and sleepovers and have their picture in the yearbook and do extracurriculars and do all of that. So when I talk to potential foster families that think they might be a little overwhelmed because they already have 3 kids and the kids do all the sports and all the extracurriculars, you'd probably be an awesome family because that is just what these kids need.
Thank you so much. Marissa, in your opinion, what is the biggest unmet needs of foster kinship and adoptive families in West Virginia? I know you've shared a little bit about this, so just let us know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, so I think we've heard from most of us on the stage some of those needs. And one of the biggest one is just having a voice. Having a voice in the process, being heard about what it is that they need and how they can be part of, loving a family and being part of the team and being treated with respect and valued for what they bring to the table. And there are some specific needs that I think we see, especially as we talk about kids. One of the things I'm working on right now is kids in congregate care, which can be residential treatment facilities, shelters, group homes, kind of all of the above. And there's a big push nationally and in West Virginia to try to reduce the number of kids in congregate care. And oftentimes they have challenging behaviors, they have disabilities, they have different labels. So especially with that group, but also really with any kid, some of the really specific supports, and I would say all families need these, crisis response, and in particular crisis response that shows up in 15 to 30 minutes, not in 3 hours. It's not on the phone, and every time I say that to anyone in a state agency, or they look at me and go, "Oh, we can't do that." And I say, well, what if we trained people in communities? What if we trained foster families and their support systems, or birth families and their mom who lives 2 streets over, even if it's just in de-escalation and some things that can, until someone more trained can get there. But, what if we had communities that were really trauma-informed that could help, so that if I, as the caregiver, am triggered and I can't de-escalate this particular situation, I have someone close by who could. Another is, we've talked about peer support, and that really peer support, everyone involved in child welfare really needs peer support, whether it's youth, whether it's birth families who are experiencing having their kids removed and trying to navigate the system, whether it's foster, adoptive, kinship, having someone who's similarly positioned, who has been there, who really gets it, and you'll have a different conversation than you will with anybody else about what the system is like and what you're experiencing, what your challenges are. And then the last one, in terms of specific supports, I would say is respite. And in West Virginia, we do not have a great system for respite, and especially when we start talking about more challenging kids, you need respite almost daily, and we don't have it.
Yeah.
And one way we could do that, and we struggle with this a little bit in our state, but one way we can do that is by connecting foster families to help support each other. Yeah. But then we have agencies and all kinds of other regulatory issues around that. But having people who can provide trained respite, who can help, especially Rachel mentioned needing homes for teens. And oftentimes, if you have a teen who just came to your home, you don't know exactly their history, I'm not sure I want to leave them home alone after school every day, but I can't send them to daycare.
Right.
There's no daycare on the planet that takes a 15-year-old. If I'm lucky enough to live in Charleston or maybe Morgantown, I might have an after-school program, maybe. Yeah. But if I live in Welch or someplace in Preston County or something, I'm trying to think of rural areas, that may not be available. So how can we, help support families in caring for kids when parents are working and when other things are happening? Those are just a few of the specific supports, and then of course foster closets and concrete items too. But
thanks, Michelle. Marissa, I'm sorry. Pam, what is something that you wish all foster, kinship, or adoptive parents knew going into the process? And you spoke to that a little bit earlier.
The special something.
Yeah.
All right. I think there's a couple of them, but they're related. Here are the ones that stand out to me. Whether the season is short or long, your impact on a child is indelible. And in my heart of hearts, I believe that there's a reason why paths cross and people come together. Knowing that there is really, truly a reason and a season for my time with a foster child or a child who may become my adopted child, that has really helped me cope with what was at the time, because it has happened to me as a foster parent, the unfathomable grief that comes with loss if and when they must leave your home. So just having faith and belief that there is a reason and a season, and that every day, every moment, every word, every action is indelible and has meaning and helps to grow and improve them in the situation is important. Another thing would be not to expect that the kids will show you gratitude or appreciation for your sacrifices that you're making for them. They may be angry, hurting, confused, and they will take it out on you as a foster or kinship parent. Despite all of your best efforts, your love, and the fact that you're doing everything right according to everybody else. You have to be prepared for that and realize that it's not about you. Lastly, longing, curiosity, and affection for the birth family, even the birth family that they've never met. And despite what may be an unbelievable history of abuse and neglect, that longing, curiosity, and affection is not a reflection of or a rejection of a foster family. Active, overt, and very creative, covert actions and efforts to reach out and get information or contact with birth family is incredibly common And it is in part an effort to physically or emotionally attempt to repair the breach. You can't take that personally. It's part of growth, a process, and we have to support kids through that.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I hope y'all are listening. This is some really good information that these women are up here sharing with you and giving you. And I love that you hear their stories and you hear what they're saying. And you hear some of the same narratives, right? You hear some of the same things. And that's because they've been in this work, working with children, working with families for a long time. And so they've learned these things over time. And so I pray that today that you would heed their wisdom, heed their insight. We're going to have one last question for Michelle, and then we'll wrap up. If there was one request that you could make of every church and community leader here about foster, kinship, and adoptive care, what would it be?
Be willing to get your hands dirty. Yeah. Dive in. Like I said, it's messy, it's hard, but man, Christ sacrificed so much for us. Think of, he left a perfect heaven and came here. He was laid in an animal's food trough. I mean, like, we sacrifice, we really do, but it's, in the long run, it's so little. Be willing to do the things that are uncomfortable, have uncomfortable conversations. Reach out to all the different aspects. If you don't feel called to foster, don't. But there are things you can do. One of the things we do at Bible Center is a ministry to our CPS workers in our county. We serve a formal dinner, cloth napkins, waiters and waitresses are people from our church, and we have steak and a guest speaker once a year just to let them know that they have a hard job. We love them, we support them, because often caseworkers get to be seen as the enemy also in so many foster situations. So be willing to get out there and do things, and be willing to try something. If it doesn't work, make adjustments, but if you see a need, try to meet it. And then even forming support groups and being there for people that are fostering. If you can be trained to do respite care, if you're not called to foster but you'd like to help, do respite care. So essentially, circling back to what I said before, know your congregation, see who's interested, what skills do they have. Maybe you've got someone that does they repair brakes on cars, and they can do that for foster families or grand families or relatives raising children. And then just love people. God calls us to love him and love others, and that would be what I would request.
Can y'all give our panelists a round of applause and thank them for being here?